My name is Dave McComiskey, and I'm Vice President of Governance and Leadership at Governance Solutions. And I'm delighted to be with our very own Vice President of Governance and Strategy, Rob DeRooy. Rob, do you want to take leadership for the first bit?
Sure, I'll take this on for a bit. Thanks, Dave, and welcome everyone. It's great to be here today. It's nice to see so many people have joined us. And as we approach the beginning of July here, we're hitting the end of school years for those of you that have kids or grandkids, and it's really swinging into the beginning of summer. So I can tell you the weather here in Ontario is pretty wet, at least in this part of Ontario, which has been welcome. But it was more summery in May than it's been in June. Anyway, I want to start us off. Let me just share my screen. I want to start off just by saying the not-for-profit sector is vast. And there are many different types and sizes of not-for-profits. So this may not be a one-size-fits-all, because some of the largest ones have a full complement of professional staff that allow the board to be a governing board where they only have one hat to wear. But for the majority of not-for-profits, board members are expected to wear multiple hats usually. So I thought we'd lead off with that. We've worked with hundreds, if not thousands, of not-for-profits at this point. And we do tend to work with the larger ones because they have the resources to hire professional services. But we're also board members, and each of us has spent time on boards, including on small not-for-profits. So I've seen the whole spectrum of not-for-profit, from the very large and to my local curling club. I always bring that up, but that's my passion outside of work. So I've spent a lot of time on and around curling club boards. So, but regardless of the size of the not-for-profit board you're on, you will most likely be asked to provide secondary role that goes above and beyond what you will ever asked to do on a private sector board. You may be asked or even be required to be a donor or a large donor beyond some of the larger charities that we see here in Canada and around the world, quite frankly. And that's not uncommon. Or you may be asked to be an advocate out promoting the organization and speaking on behalf of the organization. There's some correlation for the private sector in that if you're on a private sector board, you're probably going to be required to own shares. It's not the same as a donation. You get a little bit more back for your money, at least financially speaking. But it's not that common for board members to be asked to speak on behalf of the organization in the private sector. So that's a role that is definitely more commonly asked for in the not-for-profit. And you may also be asked to be a volunteer to do the work of the organization. And in small not-for-profits, that's a very common ask. And that's the area that can cloud your role as a board member the most in practice. Because your primary job, regardless of what else they ask you to do, is to be a governor, is to be a board member. And by that, I mean providing high-level direction to the organization, having a strategic plan, being involved in that and approving it, understanding the risks of the organization, providing risk governance, so risk direction. What's your tolerance for risk? What's your appetite? Having the right measures of performance in place for the organization. Giving direction on people, on your executive director and their role, as well as the board's role, as well as committee roles, who does what. And then giving direction on policy. What are the policies of the organization? What's our code of conduct? What's our policy around conflict of interest? What other policies do we need in place to make sure our journey is the appropriate journey that lives within our values and ethics? So we have all those roles plus resource control and giving direction on budget approval and making sure that we match that to strategy. So those are the board members' direction duties, and then we need to gain confidence or reasonable assurance that the direction is being followed. So that's the same that we would have in a for-profit model. But when we have that second set of roles, when we're the super volunteers for the organization, we can often lose sight of our board member duties. I've even seen organizations where those secondary duties are given primacy and the higher level governance duties fall by the wayside. In actuality, when we're doing the work of the organization, we create in many respects a circularity of accountability and make it more difficult for us to perform our governance function. Simply put, it becomes harder to judge whether we're doing the right things and if we're doing those things right. That's harder to judge when we are also the ones doing them. So it's important for not-for-profit board members to remember to take a step back, be strategic. The volunteer role you have is invaluable, but the work you're doing, someone has to question whether it's the right work and whether we're doing it well. And in that case, we have to ask ourselves that. Dave, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, when I looked at this slide, Rob, I remembered a not-for-profit I worked with in the United States, and they used the 3 W's for board member selection: wealth, wisdom, and willingness. And often wealth was at the top of the list, and they had the priorities all wrong. So it's an important reminder to make the main thing in terms of governance, that we're doing our fiduciary, our oversight role.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, I worked, one of the first engagements I had was a hospital foundation that had been in the news because their executive director had absconded with some of the funds. And that board worked very, very hard getting money for the hospital. But they did not provide enough oversight. They did not provide enough governance, and they learned the hard way. So that's the primary duty. And the others are secondary. They may seem, especially if you need to raise a lot of money, it may seem like the most important thing you could possibly be doing. But it's still the second most important thing you could possibly be doing. So that's the multiple hats. That's our first major difference between not-for-profit and for-profit. And I'm just going to add before I go on, we're going to give you 3. That doesn't mean there's only 3. It just means you can only do 3.5 an hour. So there are a lot more. So we tried to pick the 3 most prominent ones. And the next one's governance model. And what I mean by governance model mainly is how you get there. And it's the democratic model that we most often see in the not-for-profit sector. Sometimes the stakeholder model as well. Both of those models have pros and cons, and they put the power, the levers of power, in the hands of the people who have the most at stake. But this democratic model where you're voted in, it's really enshrined in your enabling legislation. If you look at the Canada Not-for-Profit Act or the Provincial Not-for-Profit Acts, they give a lot of powers to members, and they give members the power to elect board members. So that's not fully unique to not-for-profit. We see that in cooperatives as well, but it is one of the hallmarks of this sector. And combined, when you combine the elected director model in a sector that is also predominantly an unpaid role, a volunteer role, these 2 things combined, these 2 things in this governance model create unique challenges for not-for-profit boards. And especially around creating high performance boards. And what I mean by a high performance board is one that has all the skills, and I mean knowledge and experience, but I also mean what some people call soft skills, like the professionalism, the ability to work in teams, the character considerations that give you great board members. They can be a challenge to make sure we have a wide variety and the necessary variety of those skills as a whole around the boardroom table, because at the end of the day, board members come through an election process. So you get what you get, and it's often a popularity contest. So I can't tell you how many times we've diagnosed board performance challenges that would be solved, or at least partially or mostly solved, through the use of a board skills and attributes matrix. And it takes some work to do a skills and attributes matrix. You've got to determine all the skills and attributes you want around the table. No one board member is expected to be an expert in everything, but ideally the entirety of your board has expertise in all the things that are going to come before it. So putting that inventory together and then figuring out what you have, figuring out what skills and attributes you have already on the board, you can create a simple document that will tell you where you have gaps or where you have overlaps, for that matter. And a lot of not-for-profit boards are just really resistant to doing that work. And they're only resistant because in their mind, they don't have control over who comes on the board, because it's an election process, which is often just a popularity contest. And our biggest piece of advice, because of this model, is that it's the effort to go through that process and communicate it clearly. If you communicate those needs clearly to your membership and have a concerted efforts towards the nominations committee, you'll get more qualified candidates. Dave, do you want to take this next slide and unpack that?
Yeah, thanks. So just on what you just said on elected boards, I remember a piece of advice that Deborah Brown, our president, stated about boards that are elected. She said, you know, a board member has to remember what got you here is not why you're here. So you were popular with the members, but now you have a duty, a fiduciary duty to the organization to make it effective and to provide oversight there. So I really like that saying, and something I like to keep in mind when we work with elected boards. Rob, because board members are often nominated and recruited by the not-for-profits membership, the board has lost, as you said, at least to some degree, control over who gets elected and who fills the competency gaps around the board table. And so as a board, this moves your ability to choose your next board members from your sphere of control. You can't control who gets on the board to your sphere of influence. So rather than being a decision maker, you become an advocate for who gets on the board. So how can you effectively use that influence? How can you effectively advocate to impact those board elections? And the most basic method is to simply recruit effectively so that the people running to fill the gaps, that you identify those people during your board profiling exercise, that you have the skills in mind and you have people who can meet those skills needs when you're looking to put your election profile together. And this means that the nominating committee or even the board itself identifies candidates who have the necessary skills and abilities to fill those identified gaps on the board, and put together a list of recommended candidates, candidates that they'll recommend to the membership who are meeting the needs that have been seen around the board table. After we've done that skills profiling and built a matrix, we actually see a lot in the cooperative sector. A pre-screened list of recommended candidates. George, Sally, Tom, and Doris would fill the character and competency requirements that we as the board need, and we recommend them for election. And this works best if you communicate. If you think you've communicated, communicate 10 times more, both the needs that the board has and the selection process. In other words, for members to trust the recommendations that you put forward, you need to communicate the process, that it's open and fair, transparent, and that they understand that the recommendation is based on the skills and attributes that the board required and the knowledge you have as a board about what's working, what's not working around the board table. And it's not based on popularity or who you know. Rob, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that, one of the things, it's a little bit of work to do the skills matrix, but it's so worthwhile. And the process gives it legitimacy if you describe the process. And I think even beyond that, the thing we talk a lot about this, elections not giving us exactly what we need unless we can influence them. But I think there's also a huge engagement part in that, because I do see a lot of not-for-profits, even big ones, that can struggle to get board members because it's an unpaid position. And, they could be getting board members from stakeholder groups, or they could be getting just, warm bodies. And then we see a lack of engagement. I think this is the one process that if not-for-profits would really fully embrace this and fully embrace a nominations committee that is active year-round, they will get a much better quality overall of board members that has the character attributes they need to really engage in the work and to show up and be present and be active, right? It's not just about the skills. This character part's just as important. And I think it's one of the secret sauces to this working and to bringing up the entire performance level of every not-for-profit board. There's so many that don't use it yet. And because of this negative perception that, well, we don't control it at the end. And I really can't stress enough how important this is to this sector. Yeah, thanks, Dave. And then the third thing, and let's just break out this, and it's strategy. When we we do a lot of strategy work, or at least I do a fair bit of strategy work, and I usually use balanced scorecard because it forces an organization to look at its performance beyond just financial. And the interesting thing, you'll see this is a private sector model for a balanced scorecard, creating a strategic plan. And at the very top of this model is the company's vision, and after it says profit. And financial is, at the end of the day, all of the important measures of success in the private sector are financial measures of success. The profitability, the growth, the profitability, but they want both. And it's growth and profitability together that makes shareholders and owners happy. So the purpose of the organization is often tied to these financial results. And we spend time on strategy, and we talk about learning and growth. In other words, what must we innovate, and how must we work with our people, and what do we need to learn as people and in the organization. And we do that so that we can learn how to do things better, to have better processes, and to optimize those processes. And we do that to make customers happy or delight our customers. But we're doing that so that we can make money off our customers, so that we can grow and make profits off our customers. These are all the enabling inputs in the private sector, all lead to financial success. But if I look at this slide that I've borrowed from our professional director program, our certificate level training program, in the not-for-profit sector, we invert it to some extent, the whole model for a balanced scorecard. In other words, finances aren't the result. They aren't even the goal. They're an enabling process. They've moved from the very top of the model to the bottom. And we look at finances in the not-for-profit sector is something we need to give us enough resources that we can then innovate and have people and train those people so that we can do the things we want to do really, really well in service to our clients. So our vision is social relevance. Our vision is always about our service to the people we're there to serve. And it flips it right on its head. And this changes the way we think about strategy entirely when we're on a not-for-profit. We look at those finances and input, and usually we see them as a fairly constrained input. And we do create strategy around how do we get more money so that we can serve clients, not from our clients, but for our clients. And we have restricted capital in or can have in both the private and not-for-profit sectors, but our available ways to get capital are more limited in the not-for-profit sector. So we spend more time and more consideration when we're setting objectives, especially SMART objectives, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. We spend a lot more time on achievable and realistic in the not-for-profit sector than we do in the for-profit sector, because the availability of resources is more limited, usually. And then also, when I do strategic planning, when I'm looking at strategic plans for inspiration at times, I always use examples of vision and mission statements that are from the not-for-profit sector. Always. When I'm trying to convey to the people I'm working with on strategy, one of the pitfalls we often fall into is we spend a lot of time wordsmithing vision and mission statements, and we'll spend hours on that. I don't like this word. I prefer that word. And at the end of the day, in the for-profit work I do, we also want a vision statement to be inspirational and aspirational. And it's always harder to get it to say what our real aspirations are and still make it inspirational. Whereas in the not-for-profit sector, it's exactly the opposite. It's so much easier for not-for-profit board members to understand exactly why they're there, to understand what the inspirational purpose of their organization is. I find that we spend far less time on mission and vision in the not-for-profit sector, and they have an easier time of it, but we have a harder time when we're doing strategy, figuring out how we're going to resource everything we want to do, because there's so much we want to do. There's so much we want to achieve, and we spend quite a bit of time figuring out how can we get the resources to achieve it. Far more time than we would in other sectors. So the main thing, though, is that finances are an input. We need to figure them out, but we'll spend a lot more time figuring out what we want to do with the limited resources we have, and a lot less time on the financial part of the plan. So it's just resource challenges aside, I think the not-for-profit sector board has a huge advantage when working with management in setting mission, vision, values of the organization, because they have so much more clarity of purpose. Dave, do you have anything to add?
Rob, I'd only just reinforce what you said, and it's important for the not-for-profit board to understand their role in strategy formulation. It's management's job to do the hard work, to do the SWOT analysis and all of that, but the board must give input into the strategy, into the mission, the vision, and the values. And then they've got to monitor it. They've got to monitor the implementation of the strategy as well, and be clear with management and how they're going to provide oversight to that, and make sure that the organization stays on mission and is achieving to some extent its vision, and definitely living the values of the organization. So yeah, just understanding what the not-for-profits board role is in that whole strategy piece.
Yeah, great, thanks. Yeah, and this changes the measuring what matters, measuring the important things, all the important measures in the not-for-profit sector. There's a lot more non-financial important measures in the not-for-profit sector than in any other, and those are the harder things to measure. So they have that's the last part of planning, and they have a little harder job of it because they can't just rely on financial measures that we've been developing for 500 years. Yeah, great. Thanks, Dave.